Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dave Grady. I'm a security evangelist here at Verizon Business Group. I want to thank you for taking time to learn more about the Mobile Security Index, a new report that Verizon published just a few weeks ago. If you're not familiar with Verizon as a security provider, Verizon has been helping enterprises, large and small, secure their enterprise and secure their organization, secure their data for almost 20 years now. And Verizon is pretty well known also for the research that we do. Our annual data breach investigations report is considered the gold standard for research into data breaches. And this is our third annual Mobile Security Index report, which specifically looks at the risks associated with mobile devices, which have become so much more important to organizations, particularly over the last year. So we're going to walk through some of the findings today. We're going to talk about some of the recommendations as well. Just some house rules here. We're going to have some polls, so keep an eye on that. And there is an opportunity for you to ask some questions, and we're going to try to keep an eye on that and get to those when the time is right. Today's speakers, or my guests really, are Robert Polizzato, Senior Manager of Solution Architect Security here at Verizon Business Group, waving hello, and then Richard Stein, Senior Manager, Security Solutions Architect, East Security Team. So we've got some folks here who really know both the pain points that organizations like yours are feeling around security, as well as the solutions that Verizon can bring to bear on this challenge. Gentlemen, Robert, Richard, why don't you guys start walking our guests here through some of the findings of this Mobile Security Index report. And at some point, I'm going to jump in and explain a little bit about the methodology, but why don't you show some of the findings?
Yeah, appreciate it, Dave. So Robert Polizzato here. Thanks, everybody, for your time today. So one of the things that we're going to do is kind of set the table, right? So let's start off slow, and let's really look at what did we find in this year's Mobile Security Index that differs from before, that changes the game on how you may need to manage your own mobile security. And most importantly, I want to remind you that this index is just a great way to find out what is happening in both your industry, in business as a whole, because we have a large swath of customers that participate in this survey and give us really detailed feedback on where they're at, what they're focusing on, and most importantly, what are some of the concerns that need to be addressed both by themselves as an organization and really any other organization out there today. And so we're gonna jump into a couple of the stats here. And so I want to start here because, again, this is all about setting the table. Working from home, it's become the norm. I mean, I don't think anybody on this call is going to disagree with that. I think we've all seen it ourselves, even with some of us who are in industries where, remote work is challenging. I think we've all had to be extremely agile and kind of change the way we work just to get people the ability to work, the ability to connect, regardless of where they are. And I think that's apparent. Obviously, 80% of the organizations saw remote working increase. That I'm not surprised, right? And even 62% of the share of employees that of the organizations that we talk to, 62% of those employees are now remote compared to last year being 32%, right? So we know that some organizations were already practicing remote work or had some segment of their organization that were already going through this process or doing this on the regular. And now we're just seeing a massive increase, and we all know why, right? The pandemic has shifted the way we work and how we need to work. I think what's really interesting on this slide, and actually some of our partners titled this inversion, and it's really the idea that even after the pandemic, there are a lot of companies that really feel like, including ourselves, right, is how is it going to look permanently? Is this really remote work anymore, or is this just work, right? And it's going to become extremely normalized. And not only that, but all of the things that we did and we put into place to be agile for the pandemic, we're going to need to go back and reassess and really understand, do these technologies really support a safe and secure work environment? Is it the most productive way that they can be? Whether that's VPN encryption or private access to your corporate applications or how you're managing mobile devices, one of those things that comes up a lot, and I'm going to shift to the next one here, is BYOD. Something that not only, I mean, remote work is obvious, but in addition to being agile and saying, you can work remotely, I think we've seen a lot of our organizations allow for BYOD or bring your own device policies, right? And that number on the left, let me explain that too, because that's 36% in addition to organizations that were already doing some type of bring your own device. So many organizations that we work with already had a bring your own device policy. They already had a structure in place. And so some of this was easy because they went into the pandemic. Let's say they had a new employee come on board. They were able to use the tools that they most likely got from us, which is device enrollment programs and mobile device managers, really zero touch deploy devices out to their users in this pandemic. Now, in addition to that, we saw a bunch of other organizations start to do that. Maybe they've never done BYOD, maybe they didn't allow it before, but because of the nature of the pandemic, we've made some of those changes, and we've allowed for that just to get the foundation of, can this user work remotely now? Are they able to access what they need to, right? I think on the flip side of it, though, when you think about BYOD, I mean, there's also a big subset of customers who think that these BYOD policies might go past the pandemic. So again, it goes back to what we're saying about the redefining of what it is to be an employee outside of the four walls. And do you have all the technology in place to make that process easy for your organization? And I will call out before I hand it over to Rich to kind of keep telling this story, because it keeps going together. He'll start talking about mobile devices and the importance that grew there. But what I'll say is there's a great slide, I think it's 22, in the full MSI report, which again, we'll send you all these resources. That's just a really great way to read up on NIST framework on how we recommend you approach BYOD. So whether you've been doing BYOD or it's a new thing, it's a great recommendation page that really walks you through the framework of how to keep a BYOD device secure, regardless of if it's your device. And of course, how do we be protected but non-intrusive? So Rich, I'll hand it over to you to continue the story on mobile device.
Well, before we go to Rich, I'm sorry to jump in. We do have a poll up right now about BYOD. So if folks have a minute to take a look at that and answer that question, that might add to the conversation. And Rich, one more thing. I just want folks to know that this report, which was published in early April this year, looked at about 900 survey participants. So we did survey large and small and medium-sized businesses in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. So these numbers come directly from them: IT managers, security managers, business leaders. Also, we partnered with about 13 leading technology companies that we all know that provide mobile security solutions, and they provided us for this report with some very proprietary and specialized data and research. So occasionally you'll see some data that pops up from some of our partners. So take a peek at that. And Rich, I'm sorry to step on you there, but why don't you go on?
Thanks for that, David and Robert. So I want to start out by saying Robert put it very clearly that we have increased BYOD, we've increased work from home. Those are huge trends in the mobile world. And luckily we have mobility, because that enabled us to all be agile and develop these policies for anyone that didn't need to be in an office. 71% of the folks answered at a very high level that mobile is crucial to the smooth running of their business. So that's huge. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to know that you'll turn around for your phone before you'll turn around for your wallet or something else when you leave the house. Of course, who's left the house this year, as Robert very eloquently put. So we do know that mobility is very important. Of those 900 people, 97% of them said that remote workers be exposed to more risk than office workers. So think about this. We've increased the out of business network traffic. We've increased the bring your own device footprint. And now we're saying all of that is great, but it's also high probability for there to be risk. And so have we kept pace with that? and we can go to the next slide, talk about how we have not really kept pace with that. 65% of small businesses said that we have moved to cloud-based applications. Again, another tool that may not have been available a number of years ago. Thank goodness the pandemic happened when it did, where we could move to the cloud and have things accessible. However, with that move to the cloud, again, another surface area for attacks to attacks, breaches, malcontent users on the internet to impact us. They can now get to bring your own devices. They can now get to non-traditional internet connections from home offices, et cetera. And now the cloud is another threat vector that is more prominent than it was just a year ago. 65% of the SMBs said that they have more to lose from a security breach than larger enterprises. All of you on this call are small medium business owners and representatives, and you know that you have a very thin margin to keep the lights on at any given point. So having a huge chunk of time or loss of productivity to deal with a security breach has a big impact on your bottom line as an organization. And let's move on to the next slide. I want to talk about that not keeping pace piece of it. And we've seen the 45% of the companies sacrifice mobile device security. Speed to market is key for an agile business to continue to keep the lights on. But if we've sacrificed, 45% have sacrificed it, and the risk increased by 1.5 times, we're seeing a wider variance between what we have protected, what we've budgeted to protect, and what the reality is that we're faced with. And 23% of companies suffered a mobile-related security compromise based off of our survey. That's a big number. That means that, if you look to your left, you look to your right, and you look in front of you, one of you could potentially be suffering a mobile-related security compromise. That's a large number, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can identify those attack vectors, and then we'll ultimately get to a few recommendations as far as a framework that you can follow to better prepare yourselves for this new world of multiple attack vectors being open to the public. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave, who's going to just talk us through a little bit of the attack vectors.
And if I could just jump in, Dave, real quick before you hop in there, I think you brought up something really important, Rich, which was the attack surface has grown, right? When you think about all the things we just talked about, at the end of the day, each one of these has increased the surface or the attack surface that is possible for a bad actor. And so you start to multiply these things together, and I think it becomes really apparent that these are all wonderful things to keep us operating, although we need to treat them like the important items that they are, and this increased attack surface and what it could mean for the business. So.
Yeah, and actually, let me jump in for a second there, Robert, also. But with the attack surface, 23% of companies suffered a mobile-related security compromise. However, there are a number of companies, and this relates directly to the poll that Fallon just shared for us, and Fallon's doing behind-the-scenes work for us today, that businesses don't always know for many, many, many months, and I'm not going to spill the beans on what the DBIR tells, but the stats are astounding as how long it takes for a business to be notified of a breach or to recognize that a breach has occurred. And so while 23% know it today, I wonder how many of those folks of that 1 in 4 don't know it or don't know it yet. So moving on to the threat vectors.
Well, as I mentioned, this is the third time that we've published this Mobile Security Index, and the first one that we put out in 2018 or so was kind of received as interesting because it talked about how the mobile devices are not nearly as secure as people thought. Mobile devices, particularly smartphones, had a reputation of being, things you can't hack. And that report really helped people understand that that wasn't true. The 2020 Mobile Security Index, when that one came out, that one really helped people understand that digital transformation and IT transformation in general was already fueling the centrality, is the word I always use, of mobile devices to the business. They were no longer peripheral devices. So the report came out just in time for organizations to Unfortunately, get ready for COVID. The second report, 2020, was published just before the lockdown in February, March timeframe of 2020. Now, this report comes out this year, and it's certainly informed by what we learned over the last year, particularly with COVID, but also with the changing face of business and digital transformation. So when we talk about attack vectors, we're really talking about the ways in which bad people can kick the door open and use mobile devices or the cloud or IoT devices and others to get into networks and potentially steal information or cause damage to systems. So last year we called it just users, but it really is about users and behaviors. We also, the report gets into a lot of detail about how users and the decisions they make when they're using mobile technology can have an impact on the security posture of an organization. And we're going to look at some examples of that in a few minutes. The report gets into applications and how applications themselves, the things that you put onto your mobile devices, whether or not they add risk to the organization or if they help with security. You can hear examples about why do certain applications have access to your clipboard or your camera or your microphone, and is that a bad thing if it's not secured and can snoop on you? Devices and things. It's not just the device that you hold in your hand, but that is a concern, and we're going to learn why in terms of the firmware and the operating systems and the vulnerabilities there. But also, if any of you are experimenting with or embracing IoT, Internet of Things, those devices have increasingly become a vector in a place for bad guys to sneak in and take advantage of poor security or poor built-in security. And then finally, the networks themselves, and we're going to talk a little bit about Wi-Fi and such, and cloud applications that are increasingly being central to your business. These are really the four main areas. And as Rich and Rob said, the report is also going to, when we go through it, not just describe the problem, but really offer up a lot of solutions through that NIST framework. So how do we want to do this? We want to talk about the polls, or we want to talk about these attack vectors right now?
Well, while we're deciding on the poll side, I'll just make a comment here, right? I mean, this is one of the things, like you said, that the 2021 MSI has really improved for everybody who's reading it, is we've gotten to the point now where mobile security has become so important, we actually can break it down to these NIST-style frameworks of here are 4 key areas in which you need to assess if you want to make sure you are secure. And then as far as the poll, before we go to the next one, let's see, which poll do we have live right now?
Have you experienced let's see, looks like we just ended one, and we have which attack vector is your biggest gap? And I can go through some of the findings just from our poll here. It's amazing the way that these all followed along with the stats that we got from those 900 some odd professionals. So I don't know if we've got some people that took part in the survey that are also here, but 100% of folks said yes, COVID has continued since March of 2020, and that's the norm for the organization and will probably continue. The BYOD program was a mixed bag, which is similar to what we saw. Some folks don't use it, some have an acceptable use policy, some have an MDM, some have multiple solutions. Having a security incident, we had many people that said no, but we did have some maybes in there as well. 17% of those that answered said maybe. That's pretty close to that 23% that are a yes. And when you're saying maybe, there's a good chance that if it's not maybe today, it'll be maybe tomorrow as well. So we definitely know that that's a big thing. And then this stat here, which attack vector is your biggest gap? Users and behaviors. We'll go into that. That is definitely the biggest area or biggest risk factor that you all have as business entities is your users and their behaviors. And that scored in at 88%. So amazing. David, we could have just run one of these calls instead of do all that research on 900 people, I suppose. With that, let's go to the next page. All right. So I am so glad that I'm getting a chance to speak about users and behavior, because as we've moved into our individual homes or home offices, some of the behavior that would be acceptable within a corporate environment seems to have been left behind a little bit. We found a 6-fold increase in the number of visits to websites posting adult content. That's the middle stat right there. That's a huge, huge increase. And what I'll say is whether adult content is within or without of your acceptable use policy, the fact is that the internet, where those content is housed, is also where a lot of malware and other nefarious individuals like to hang out and move software onto your computer, onto your handhelds. So that 600% increase is really an exponential increase when you think about that they're going to an area of the internet that is even more seedy than potentially other places that you would visit. Also, the phishing went up exponentially. A large portion of that was phishing related to COVID, vaccination, anti-vaccination, COVID reporting, CDC guideline links, et cetera. So a 364% increase, 3-time increase in the number of phishing attempts in 2020 versus 2019. And then I know for me, I get at least 1 or 2 texts a day that is saying my tracking has changed or something like that. Well, 26 times more likely to click it from a mobile device because we don't see the full address bar. We just see a couple of links, a short code link. We click on it. Before we know it, we're clicking on something that either enters malware onto the device or is asking us for credentials to steal our phish information from us on our credentials. So, Robert, I don't know if you wanted to say anything on this or if you wanted to move over to the next slide on apps.
Yeah, I'll go to the next slide, but I just want to call out the poll, too, that we're running, too, because it's interesting as we see some folks respond to that poll. How do you protect against mobile phishing? Luckily, nobody's saying that they don't. Majority of folks are training their individuals within their organization, which is a great start. We're going to talk a little bit later about can we really trust a human to make all of those, decisions around malware and phishing and what should they click on, even if they're trained. But I also get some responses here about email-based phishing protection only, which is a really big gap that really a lot of organizations have right now is where, we're protecting kind of in this 2005 version of cybersecurity where, hey, if I get an email with this malicious content in it, I'm going to block it. But there's also this whole other subset that we'll continue to dig into of they're not really going after your email as much as they have been before. They're going after social media. They're going after other ways on the device to communicate with that individual when it comes to phishing. And so there's this big gap in importance. And so I'll jump to the next slide, which is applications. I don't know, Dave, did you want to start on this or do you want me to take this?
No, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, so applications, right? I mean, this one is interesting because there's actually a lot more here than we're putting on this slide, but I want to call these 2 out because when you think about this, 31% of organizations relaxed restrictions of installing new applications to cope with, pretty much just put our hands up and said, you know what, we need to get these people up and running. I'm going to pull off some of my restrictions and kind of let whatever happens. I think this plays really into the story of BYOD as well. Or organizations that traditionally didn't do BYOD or didn't allow for BYOD now saying this, we have to do this to allow our business to operate. And I think applications fell into that same kind of black hole of we need to allow people to just get the applications they need and start working. And I think it's going to take going back in time and reassessing what we've allowed to happen over this time and really making it stronger as we know it's going to be permanent. And the other question, too, to pose with 31% of these organizations, the question also is, did they just not have a way in place to manage the installation, deployment, and control of applications to devices? That's a bigger question, right? Because, again, we have this subset of organizations that are already using things like mobile device manager and cloud private access to their applications, all of which we support them with, that allows them to manage and push out these applications regardless of the pandemic. And so, it makes me think that this same portion of organizations probably had nothing in place. And really, the only thing they could do was throw up their hands and say, I'll just allow you to download whatever you need to download and let's just get working, right? And that's a huge concern down the line. But then as I continue down that talk track of like, do we not have ways in place, some of the basic foundations in place to control and manage these applications? The same thing goes for analyzing mobile apps. If we're allowing people to just do whatever they want, even in a BYOD situation, what's to say that application that they downloaded for their child or their spouse that they're using on their off time, what's to say that that is not leaking data or trying to pull permissions or things that corporate data might sit in? There are those concerns that are happening at the same time, right? And so just like I asked before, do we not have those solutions in place? This is really easy to solve for. Some of the mobile threat options out there that will analyze your applications in your ecosystem and really make sure, are they doing the right things in comparison to your acceptable use policy? Are they using things they're not supposed to? Is shadow IT happening? All of these concerns about what are the quality of the apps that they're using, what apps are they using, and are they using apps that we don't support or we don't condone? These are huge. And when I say this, it's not just credentials, right? 4% seems like a small number, but I want you to think about that. On average, people have more than 50 applications on their smartphone, okay? And so what that means is I might even have 2 on my device that are leaking data, leaking credentials, maybe even have something malicious embedded in it, a snooper or malware, or even just permissions, right? That's the big one that I think we overlook too much, is what applications are asking for permission to what? Because if they're seeing my corporate data or they're seeing my text messages, there are business-related information inside of those messages, inside of those contacts that I prefer not to get out. And so as an enterprise, it's going to become increasingly crucial to provide restrictions and analysis on what applications are out there to reduce your attack vector and cut down on shadow IT and increase productivity. I don't know if there's anything else, so I'm going to jump over to the next piece of what we're going to break down, which is devices and things. Rich, Dave?
Well, I'll jump right in on this. The 61% of U.S. workers have allowed friends or family to use their work devices. So what Robert was saying about the apps and what apps are downloaded on devices in the off hours time, your kid getting that Peppa Pig video download app or whatever is the latest craze for young kids. 61% of the U.S. workers have basically given the device to a friend or family to use. That's a concerning stat if you've got business information on there. And so locking down devices to an appropriate usage and enforcing that appropriate usage policy is really paramount in making sure devices are kept under wraps. Half of residents or respondents are still worried about device loss and theft. And that is a key tenet to most mobile device management programs, is to be able to find lost devices. And so that is an easy one that we can move the needle on as far as getting less people concerned about that, because they'll have a solution in place if they move forward with a mobile device management platform. And then whole disk encryption on laptops, 37% of companies said they were doing that. I'm excited to have the DBIR, which will be coming out sometime in the next 30 or so days. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more about the risks involved in breaches. And I'll tell you what, not having whole disk encryption just opens you up to a world of possibilities when a device is lost. And being able to enforce whole disk encryption is key to having peace of mind as an IT professional or a business owner. So with that, key things are make sure you know what's on the devices, as Robert said with apps. Make sure you know who's using the devices. If you restrict what's able to be done on the device, only the people that are supposed to do things on the device will naturally be able to use it. So these very, very closely tie together as far as apps and then the devices and what can be done on them. Let's move on to the next, which is a little bit more about devices, and Robert's going to take us away on that.
Yeah, I'll just extend. I'll go quick on this one. I'll just extend what you're saying about devices and things. I mean, think about, 5-10 years ago, we were all having the conversation of, is a mobile device just as important, just as much of a need to be secured, or just as crucial to the business as a PC or a laptop? A lot of people used to say no to that. And I think we've seen that gap come together. And I think everybody can probably agree that whether I have a laptop, whether I have a desktop computer, a PC, a server, an IoT device, a smartphone, at the end of the day, every single one of those devices has a risk inherently for the company, right? And so what I want to call out here is that we know that we're probably not taking IoT devices as seriously as we should from the get-go, right? And I'll also say this, you may not think you're doing anything in the IoT space, but I will tell you, if you're doing any sort of non-voice transmission, whether it's a hotspot, a jetpack, an air card, a SIM-based embedded chipset in one of the products you manufacture, or a router or a gateway, a lot of those technologies need to be treated the same way. We may not realize that those categorize into an IoT device, and they increase our attack surface, right? And so the big thing I want to make sure we all think about here is, are you doing anything in that space, whether or not it's directly IoT related or it's for another business purpose, but it's using the same exact technology, like a gateway or a router, an air card, to do some sort of operations for you? Are we taking those as seriously as we are the smartphones? And it's the same conversation we had 5 years ago with, are we taking the smartphones as seriously as the PCs? And I think we've solved a lot of that gap, but now we're starting to move into this second wave of, there's all these devices out there that we're not treating like entry points to our network. And jetpacks, hotspots, all those things are great examples because we don't really think of them as IoT. But even if that user, or even if there is no user, those devices are providing connectivity back to something that you should be encrypting and protecting. It's very simple to do, and you should be able to enable the same type of malware-based protections on those devices as well. And I'll just call this out, and the reason why I'm so concerned about this is 91% of people doing something in the IoT space who responded are collecting some sort of PII, right? Some sort of data that can get themselves in trouble, right? And I'll remind you that a lot of them are not encrypting it, right? 1/4 of them are not encrypting it, it's just so easy to do that it's a shame that they may learn the hard way when they're not encrypting that data at such a basic level. And so I'll just put in an example for you, right? Even if you're not dealing with PII or access to your direct network, there have been many breaches to IoT-based device simply for other purposes, right? They're spoofing, they're using the data off the line. There's many reasons why they may have motive to come after those devices. And I'll leave it with this. If we know that we are not taking these devices as seriously as we probably should, right there is motive for bad actors, right? We know that bad actors are smart. Just like the email thing, they know that emailing you a phishing link is really hard to do because most organizations have email-based protection. But when they start going in your Facebook and your Instagram and your Wells Fargo and your OS notifications and gaming notifications, that's when they start to gain that upper hand. And I think with IoT, they have a little bit of that upper hand as well. All right, I'll throw it over to Rich and Dave for networks and cloud.
Yeah, so I talked a little earlier about the increased attack vector, and we saw the stats, 65% of applications were moving to the cloud based off of the pandemic being a driving force. 51% of the companies that experienced a mobile-related compromise attributed at least in part to a network threat. network and cloud threats are real. I will also say that Wi-Fi and man-in-the-middle attacks are still a thing. Funny aside, I visited my brother about a month ago and asked to use his Wi-Fi network. And he's like, oh, mine says FBI van number 5, FBI surveillance van number 5. I was like, that's a great idea. I should change my Wi-Fi name at least to something that no one's going to guess is the Stein households. Although the FBI van may have tipped people off that it was somebody snarky like my brother. But did you know that 12 connections are made on average per day? 12 Wi-Fi connections. This time we've seen that drop a little bit because people have been more restrictive with where they're coming and going. But if there are 12 Wi-Fi connections per day and 4% of your users are connecting to at least one risky hotspot each year, how many users do you have? How many people are going to that Starbucks that is actually Starkbucks and is not the actual Starbucks Wi-Fi and are having a man in the middle connect to a device to pull information and to view browser information right from a device using a Pineapple broadcasting a Wi-Fi signal? And that is still happening today. Sometimes it's now done instead of sitting in coffee shop surfing, it might be parking lot surfing. And so you want to make sure as a business, you're checking to make sure your Wi-Fi, your guest Wi-Fi, that the traffic is segregated, that if it doesn't need to be broadcast to everyone, it's not broadcast to everyone. If you have jetpacks that broadcast a Wi-Fi signal, that you've enabled them to not show the Wi-Fi SSID. There are a number of things that you can put in place to help restrict access to Wi-Fi, to help just make it harder for malcontents to access your network or to propose a network that is artificial, that looks like it's your own office-based or home-based Wi-Fi network. So just calling that out, that's a huge number, 12 connected. I'm sure it'll dip as we get the back half of the pandemic numbers, but even still, 12 different Wi-Fi connections per day is a big number. Go ahead.
And Rich, I just want to add there too, because I think there's a flip side to this, right? Is we've got all these users working from home. Traditionally, that's really tough for an IT department. Like, we want to own the connection to the internet for obvious reasons, because if I own the connection to the internet, I can provide safety mechanisms that will protect my users. But when I take these users and I put them anywhere, or even at home, how secure is their home Wi-Fi? How do you guarantee security on a Wi-Fi that may have been set up in a home with nobody who's very technical? And you think about it, even the default password, has that even been changed off the device? We don't know, right? And so these are the unknowns of also at-home Wi-Fi. And we did a really great last year on the MSI. We actually did a great comparison of the risk level based on corporate private Wi-Fi, hotel Wi-Fi, at-home Wi-Fi, all that stuff. And at-home Wi-Fi, although it's not as risky as public Wi-Fi, it's still much, much riskier than being in a corporate environment because, again, we don't own that internet connection. We can't secure that connection. So you'll have to look for other ways to secure that connectivity. And the great part about it is that the solution is usually overlapping, right? It's going to protect from not only risky hotspots, but give you some of the encrypted or protected access, even on a home Wi-Fi network that you cannot really guarantee doesn't have any intrusions into it.
Yeah, I find the gap between Wi-Fi and BYOD devices is a prominent gap in security platforms. On your work-based device, okay, you might have a mobile device management that'll put in some protections. On your home-based, on your office-based Wi-Fi, you may have some protections, but that BYOD device on a home network really leaves a lot to be desired if you haven't encrypted it, if you haven't at least encrypted a partition within that device for corporate data, or you have not mandated a VPN across a network. for connectivity back into your back-end systems, either to the cloud or to your own data centers. Go ahead. I think you were going to say something, David.
I was just going to say that we spent a few minutes here talking about these 4 different attack vectors. We actually have a poll here that shows that most of the folks here say the biggest gap they have with the attack vectors is users' behaviors, about 88%, and then the rest were devices and things. And you can extrapolate a little bit from that. The fact that apps is 0 either means that they've got great controls over it, or they don't have the visibility that they need to really evaluate the risk associated with the apps. Maybe devices and things is smaller because the IoT is not being rolled out en masse yet, but it's going to be, as you said, more central to the business over time. What the report does, and what we're going to move to now, is okay. So you recognize that you've got some gaps in these 4 attack vectors, that you can't, say that you've got 100% certainty over all 4 of them. The report talks about how to actually close those gaps. And what I want to do is give an example here. And just coincidentally, most of you said that users and behaviors are the biggest gap that you have here. This is meant to illustrate what you'll get when you read the Mobile Security Index. We have taken recommendations for how to resolve all these issues that the report describes. We've mapped them to the NIST cybersecurity framework. If you're not familiar, it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's the cybersecurity framework for how most organizations think about how they need to secure their organizations. First, they have to identify what the risk is. They have to protect against attacks and threats. They have to be able to detect attacks and then detect breaches. They need to be able to respond quickly should they find themselves in the middle of a cyber incident. They need to be able to recover. And those are the sort of the 5 main things that the NIST security framework talks about. In the report, for users and behaviors, for apps, for devices, for things, we provide some advice here, some recommendations on how to start to close those gaps. So as an example, for users and behaviors, one thing you might want to do is categorize commonly attacked users. We call them VAPs, VAPs in the report. Those are very attacked people. It's senior level people in your organization who have access to approvals for wire transfers, right? Those are the people who usually get attacked, people who are network administrators and such. To prepare for that eventuality, you need to know who the targets have paint on their back. Another way you can identify the gaps in users and behaviors is to do like an attack simulation, to actually take a Friday morning and walk through a scenario, how you might respond to that. The report then goes into how you can protect, and that gets into things like the training, and again, very much the user behavior, and how you can initiate a web isolation solution, basically using technology to mitigate the risks, as Rich and Rob mentioned, of man-in-the-middle attacks or phishing attacks or ransomware even, through that web browser. The report goes on to explain how you can detect things like mobile threat detection solutions, and then how you can respond to an attack and then recover. So as you're concerned about trying to close the gaps in users and behaviors and apps, et cetera, you can use this report to, as I said, really start to understand the steps you can take. And I think that's really the value of the report. And the last thing I want to say before, remind folks that we do have time for questions and answers is, the numbers that we looked at over the last 40 minutes or so, they just blow my mind to some degree, because there's clearly a recognition that mobile devices are so important to the business. They were before COVID, they're going to be after COVID. And yet at the same time, there's a clear hand-wringing, a lot of high numbers on the worried about lost devices, worried about the exposure that mobile workers have, remote workers have for attacks. So there's a recognition, and then there's worry, and then where's the action, right? So not enough people are taking that action. In fact, the big number in the report is about 40% or so are cutting corners on security. So that can't continue. And I think right now we're at an inflection point as things are starting to, God willing, get better for business and personal lives right now, and the way that we're all operating. As we get back to work, we've got to address this issue now. So the report, as I said, talks about how you close those gaps. What do we want to?
And this is just a snapshot, right? Like there's so much more that walks you through. I mean, really, how you could go about securing each of these. And I love that we started here on users and behaviors. This is by far my favorite attack vector. I know that sounds weird, but it's for good reason, because I think it's where we have the most amount of work to do. I think applications and devices and things, like if you consult with us and you work with partners and consultants and get the right expertise in place, you can find solutions to help you automate responses to most of it. But the human aspect of users and behaviors is one of the most challenging things to manage in the world. And I think everybody can agree that human element really causes the most amount of risk, because we don't know how the human's going to respond every time. And I'll say this, a few things that I want to call out is, you look at like reviewing your acceptable use policy, or AUP. I mean, that's something that organizations can do for free. Like, do you even tell your users what and what they cannot do on that device? And then once you tell them that, do you have software in place to make sure that the AUP is followed? Those things are very easy to start, and also helps them stay away from increased, again, Rich said it before, these areas of the internet where more malicious behavior takes place. And I'll kind of end on this, right? Is like, I think it goes back to phishing too. Performing regular training, which a lot of you are already doing, which is great. But even myself, I take pride in when I score 100% on our internal phishing trainings. I feel great about myself, but I still don't know that even with my expertise, I'm going to be able to catch anything. Because think about me in an airport or traveling or walking, and I look at an email or I look at something, I open it, especially when things come through other applications other than email. It may open up a browser in Instagram or Facebook where they don't even see the URL. And so can we really trust that human element to protect us, especially with things like phishing is just a big one to call out because of the increase and so forth. And I'll leave you with this stat, which I find absolutely alarming, but it tells us we have a lot more work to do. When Proofpoint, one of our amazing partners, surveyed employees, they asked, do you know what phishing is? Right? And I'm sure there was a little qualifier there to make sure they really knew and so forth. But almost 50% of people didn't get the answer right. Now, whether that's because they weren't paying attention, which is just as concerning when they're looking at a phishing or a malicious link, or if they truly didn't know, that just tells us we have a lot of work to do when it comes to training and then overlaying software and automation to make sure that the human has a little bit of backup support. Because I know that I need it, even as an expert, right? And I'll say this last thing too, right? You want to protect the user from themselves sometimes, and even in a BYOD scenario where you might not have control of the device, can you deploy mobile threat defense to keep your corporate data safe and to keep their personal life safe? Because I'll be honest, I don't want any of my employees being phished, whether it's personal information or corporate information. I don't want any of my employees having that damage done in their life. And so you think about all the stuff you can do, it's just an easy place to start to say, what can we start laying together to really protect these users and build better habits?
Rob, you talked about the AUP. Rich, do you want to talk just a little bit more? I think the next slide has an interesting statistic and some advice on what and how to use those.
Yeah, so we're gonna be wrapping up here in just a moment. So there's two things that you're gonna get as a result of this call. One is you have access to people like Robert and I that love to geek out on these topics. That's something that's free. You can consult with your team, your sales team. They can get in touch with Robert, myself, and our team of folks across the country that do this day in and day out and really enjoy helping businesses become more secure. The other thing you're going to get as a result of this, and it's on the landing page, which we'll show that resource in a minute here, is a step-by-step guide of an acceptable use policy. And I know the poll was just put up there, do you have an acceptable use policy? And 100% of you said yes, but it's probably outdated. I don't know that we had full participation because I would venture to say there's a number of folks that don't have one in place because 57% of the 900 that we surveyed did not. But we can help you get that started. And having it written down is important. I think about within my own family, if I didn't have an acceptable use policy before dinner started about whether my kids could or could not bring their cell phone to the table, there would be 100% of cell phones at the table. And so we don't want to make that decision after we've sat down to start eating. We want to make that decision ahead of time, be proactive. And in the same way in our business lives, we want to make sure that we've got acceptable use policies written out ahead of time for our business users to know what they can and can't do on their device. And then we back that up, as Robert just said, with some automated capabilities to detect, respond, identify all of those gaps that may be caused by users and behavior. And so the AUP is really central to getting security right. I'm shocked that 57% don't have one in place, but as someone who's got kids just coming of age, it doesn't surprise me either, because my kids still bring the phone to the table. So that being said, I think it's pervasive in our lives, both personally and professionally. Acceptable use policy is a hot topic, and this is a free resource that you folks all get. Also something I love to consult on and just give ideas. I'm certainly not going to give you a pre-planned forum, but it will certainly be great to kick ideas back and forth. So I want to offer that up, and I think we're ready to move on to the resources of the next slide.
Yeah. So we're almost done here. We're going to wrap up. We just really want to end with what resources available. I want to make this really easy, so I'll put it in the chat pod as well. But if you remember one thing, where do you go for all of the access to these tools? You go to Verizon.com/mobile security index. That's it. Verizon.com/mobile security index. I will add that into the chat pod as well if it lets me here. But I'll say it one more time. Verizon.com/mobile security index. You're not only going to get access to the full report. There's a really great executive cheat sheet that I love because it breaks down a lot of the key findings for your conversations within your organization. We've also got the SMB Spotlight. So it'll break down organizations in your footprint in the small to medium business range. So you're taking some of the enterprise concerns out and really focusing on what you should be doing. And then, of course, we've got the assessment tool and the AUP guide, the acceptable use policy guide. So one, the assessment is great because what it'll do is it's really quick to finish. It's about 10 questions, and it'll just let you know if you're on track to the rest of our respondents, or if you're a little bit behind our respondents, or you're ahead of them. And then, of course, the AUP. Like Rich said, super important to lay the groundwork and get your acceptable use policy out there. It's free to do that. You just need to pull together some of your business managers and leaders to make sure everyone's invested and set the rules. And a lot of the solutions and gap fillers and protections will follow very naturally after that. And of course, I will say this, there is a poll out there, an easy one. I think a lot of you are taking advantage of you want us to like you here, but a lot of you are already answering it correctly, which is you can reach out to your account team. You can set up meetings with folks like myself and Rich. We have an entire team of cybersecurity specialists that can help you assess and help you consult on whatever it is that you got out of today. And so again, I'll say it one last time, and don't forget, we will send out an email with all of these resources for you. But just to remember, in case you're ready to go here, it's Verizon.com/mobile security index. And that's all I got. Any parting words, Dave, Rich, before we give everybody some time back in their day and talk to them later?
Just want to thank everybody for joining us today.
Thanks for moderating this chat with us, David, and appreciate the time that we had with each of you, customer and business owners that we've got out there. Thanks a lot, and we will talk to you again soon, I hope.
Thanks, everybody, for your time. Again, Verizon.com/mobile security index. Reach out to your account manager, set up these conversations, and help yourself assess what you can focus on for 2021 as far as mobile security is concerned. Appreciate your time, and thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.